Alex here with a high conflict child custody video on breastfeeding. This is not an issue that came up in my case, or it would have definitely had its own topic by now. A lot of times when this did come up, it was just kind of annoying, mainly because to me it didn't make any sense. But then I started to see some of the reasons that people cited, specifically that when there's a biological or scientific need, that particular need overrules or overrides the necessary, I guess, sort of approach of fairness and equal custody rights. And what I mean by that is between moms and dads. So now that I saw this approach, I actually want to do a video on it because I actually have something more in depth to talk about. I kind of agree with the general principle that the government should take an approach to make sure that their citizens are treated fairly and equally, unless there's some kind of overruling or overriding scientific, medical, or biological need. I actually understand where that's coming from. The problem is in this particular example of breastfeeding, there are scientific, whatever you want to call them, scientific biological needs that are being ignored if you only look at it from one side. So the one side is, hey, I'm a mom, I should have primary custody because of breastfeeding issues, and I know it's not fair and I know it's not equal rights, but science and biology and all that stuff, therefore it's okay. The problem with this is that there's also, of course, studies, research, and science that supports a child, especially at that age, having contact with dad too, even if it's not necessarily mostly the child that is directly benefiting, but is secondarily benefiting by a father bonding with the child, which later on can manifest in an actual real benefit to the child when the child is older. The other issue that kind of exacerbates that particular problem is if the father feels like it's not sincere, if the father feels like it's just being weaponized as, to use a term that's floating around all the time, alienation, an alienation strategy. So you have a problem that I think that is a problem of not being able to not only see both sides of the equation, but also not being able to look long term. And the type of parent that's going to do that, that's going to look very short term, in my opinion, is the type of parent that only cares about themselves. It's a really harsh thing to say, especially because it's kind of one of those silver bullets that's floating around out there. Everybody talks about the domestic violence silver bullet, but not many people talk about the breastfeeding silver bullet. And it's probably because a lot of judges understand what I just said and it's not effective in many states. But I do know that in other states it is effective because I do get emails from my viewers in those states who are so frustrated. Indiana, for example, there's a parent who's been dealing with an alienating mom for so many years. And it was to the point of ridiculous how often she was using the breastfeeding. I mean, I don't know how old this child was that she was claiming she wanted to do that. It's a really good way to make yourself look strange, especially in front of a female judge. You might get away with it, with a male judge, but man, and you know what's even more troublesome? There's two other things. There's so many dynamics to this particular issue. One of those is even if the parent doesn't get a physical custody, a permanent physical custody award because of this, they'll sometimes get a temporary physical custody award, which will still frustrate the father. And oftentimes later on, that becomes a problem when the breastfeeding is no longer an issue. And then the parent says, oh, well, now the child's used to me. So, yeah, it's true, that's not an issue anymore, but I've had primary custody for 2 years, and therefore now it should be permanent. So there's the gamesmanship and the strategy. And then the other problem is the lobby, because it's like it's one of those hot button popular issues like abortion, also breastfeeding. And so sometimes a high conflict mom will deputize that lobby, or there will, even if they don't successfully do that, there may be that the appearance or the fear, whether it's by the other parent, the other lawyer, or mostly the judge, especially a male judge. They don't want to be seen like, I don't want to say all of them. I just, in some senses, the weaker ones that are easier to manipulate are more likely to say, "Uh-oh, what if I get attacked for doing this?" As out of touch or as chauvinist or whatever. So yeah, and I was just talking about the primary physical, or yeah, the primary physical permanent custody award and the temporary award, and I didn't even bring up the contempt games. So there's that too. So there may be a mom who's not able to get that sort of advantage in the sense of a custody designation, but they withhold the child all the time. And then the other parent tries to hold them in contempt and they say, well, breastfeeding, blah, blah, blah. And then the judge is like, crap, now what am I going to do? Fine them, throw them in a cell? That could end up, blowing up in my face too. It's it's unfortunate that it's become mostly a tool of the high conflict parent. And I think that's the case because reasonable parents will find a way to make that work. They can store it, they can, exchange bottles with the dad. If they're especially low conflict, they can just leave the child with mom while dad goes to work, which is a right of first refusal that's not embedded in a court order. So it's the parents that are not trying to work it out, well, the mom that uses it as a weapon that's turned it into kind of almost a joke. And it's sad that it's come to that. There are two other things I want to talk about. One of them is relocating parents and large distances. So they'll relocate when the child is super young, and then now they'll say, hey, we can't do joint custody because I live across the country. So you're going to have to pick one of us to be primary, and because of the breastfeeding issue, it should be me. That happens. It's really messed up, but that happens. And then the only reason I'm saying it's messed up is because from the perspective that it's not a sincere relocation and a sincere request, but rather it was a person who thought, if I'm going to win, what do I need to do? Okay, baby's only 6 months old. All I have to do is move to New York and then file for primary physical and tell the judge, since you can't make a shared custody, I have. You know what? That actually goes back to the beginning. So I don't know if most of the people on this channel by now are probably used to joint custody, but for those of us who were litigating this when it was a very new thing, one of the very common strategies of a mom, and back then they weren't even all high conflict. They may have just wanted to get what their mom had, what all other parents had at the time. They may have just wanted to take advantage of the last dredges of moms get custody by default. And so they would find a general sort of approach. There's all sorts of ways to approach this, but generally what they would say is, Judge, I understand that you're supposed to give joint custody now, but in this particular situation, joint custody is impossible. They wouldn't say they wanted custody yet. First, they would establish joint custody is impossible. Then, once that is established, they'd go, yeah, so, since you can't really do that thing you're supposed to do, you should just give me custody like the good old days. So that is sort of the approach when it came to relocation. And then, shoot, even if they're not relocating, you could kind of think about that as just sort of the generic approach of breastfeeding. Say you don't live far apart. Say you don't. Say you live in the same city. They could still use that. They could still say, hey, because of the breastfeeding issue, you can't really give joint custody, which isn't true, but they'll argue it. And since you can't give joint custody, you're going to obviously have to give it to me because of the breastfeed. So it's first you disqualify the possibility of joint, and then once it's disqualified, you urge the court to take the default position from the old days, which is to give primary custody to mom. So I don't know. I mean, I've talked about it from every possible angle that I could talk about it. I think this video will probably be helpful for some of you guys that are going through this, or just sort of as a thought experiment. But it does put the judges in a tough spot, not as much as in the old days. Like in Nevada, this is no longer really a thing. I just don't hear about it here anymore. When it does get brought up, the judge is like, no, joint custody, share milk, and move on. And if there's a mom that's like doing breastfeeding for a really, really long time beyond the appropriate age, it comes off to the judge as a mental health concern. You call it choice if you want to, but it's especially dangerous to do that with a female judge because they'll see right through it and they'll hold it against the parent. Even if they don't put it in the order that they think they're a crazy person, they'll find a way to. You just don't want to do that in Nevada. It's just not effective here. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to post them down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time.